I think too, for individuals that are not in research, not in science, not at the university, like the things that are occurring at the university in the research labs from the funding aspect, from a censorship aspect, like the things that we study relate to health. And so when you have cuts on health related research, well, then that is going to affect at some point, health outcomes, right? Because the research is what drives application and policy, right? And so the things that are occurring right now, like it might seem, abstract or far away. No, these things at some point, right, are going to have real world impacts. And what it looks like now is they're going to be negative ones. So, and I think to start off with this conversation is something that just to like really reiterate and make the point that these things affect our field in our area, and the populations that we would be working with as practitioners is what happened with Dr. Kevin Hall. For those that don't know, Kevin Hall is a top tier legend in obesity, metabolic health research. The both of us in our time in academia and learning about things have read his papers, for many years, right? And he was at the NIH. Well, as we know, there's new leadership in many of these agencies, including at the NIH. And just this last week, I believe, and I was put onto it because I saw you post about it, Dr. Hall left the NIH for very particular concerning reasons that I think speak to the larger sort of trend, the larger actions of censorship, because data did not really fit what the new leadership and the new health secretary, we'll get into that dude, really want to present, right? So I know you are familiar with this, and including the data in the paper that was in question, or at least partly in question. So why don't you tell us a little bit of that, and yeah, tell us what happened there.
Yeah, so I've been familiar with Dr. Kevin Hall's research, primarily with his research about energy balance model of obesity. And so that's one thing that like really sparked a lot of interest in nutrition and probably in like kinesiology and other fields where they're interested in like, well, what causes obesity? What causes weight gain? So Kevin Hall was one of the individuals that really did good studies to understand that energy intake or that having like an imbalance in calories in, calories out does play a really important role in weight gain over time. And he did really good controlled studies in metabolic wards. So what that means is that people would come in and for a period of a couple weeks to like a month, so not a super long time, but it's expensive to feed people and keep them
Right.
housed like all day. So they would do really controlled studies and they would track everything, like people's poop, like everything, to really understand the mechanisms behind obesity. And so it's interesting because I think that the way that he approaches things will be like he's skeptical of something, so then he wants to test it. And I think that that's really good. So his most recent projects have been focused on ultra processed foods. And so he admits he's a skeptic that ultra processed foods would cause obesity. And so what he has been doing is building on research to understand in humans whether or not ultra processed foods cause obesity independent of like the calorie content, the carbs, proteins, fats. So basically he's like, if we have a really processed meal and it's like a, I don't know, a ready to microwave or ready to eat sandwich, and then you have like a natural sandwich that like, you made from a farm, if they're the same calories, would somebody eat more of the ultra processed one? And then why? And so, a landmark study from 2019 was the first data to show in humans that if you match the calories, the fiber, the protein, you match everything in two types of meals for 2 weeks, and one is ultra processed and one is minimally processed, that people will eat 500 more calories per day on the ultra processed diet versus the less processed diet. And so then people would gain weight over time as a result of like being able to eat more of this ultra processed food. And so I'll like pause there and like let us, talk about that study before I get into what his most recent study showed related to ultra processed foods, because that's the study that allegedly the Department of Health and Human Services was censoring. But up to this point, they were all like in agreement with his research. And by they, I
Right.
mean like Trump's leaders in health departments.
Yeah, his work, like you nicely sort of laid out, is kind of getting at, does ultra processed food by a distinct mechanism, right, other than the energy intake, caloric balance, cause weight gain and obesity, right? And that's super important because there is a thought, right, especially against or towards the sort of maha optimizer, bro, crunchy, health, holistic, guru type people, that ultra processed food causes all kinds of problems, including obesity, but in an independent way that is different than other types of food, right? So yeah, his work was important in highlighting. It's like, no, it's still calories, right? It's still the energy intake, but again, like you mentioned, and it's maybe not a surprise, but it means something to have like actual scientific empirical data of like, if you're eating M&Ms versus an apple, is way easier to overeat M&Ms than it is for an apple, right? And all of that is like intuitive, right? But it's good to have that data. But the thing that is an issue with a lot of things, I think, is the fact that that gets taken as, oh, these people, the establishment, the scientific hegemony, the scientific establishment, they're pro ultra processed food. You will not find one motherfucker in science, in academia, in nutrition, in dietetics that will say you should eat a lot of ultra processed food. No one will say that. What will they say? Limit. You don't have to necessarily exclude, right? But limit it. And one thing, and I'm sure this will probably get brought up at some point, is what? Yeah, sure, they're not that healthy because they don't have a lot of nutrients, right? Vitamins, minerals, micronutrients, and things like that. They facilitate overconsumption. And then two, the other thing that I think goes underappreciated is the fact that if you're eating high amounts of ultra processed food, what does that mean? You're not eating more nutritious whole foods that have vitamins and nutrients and micronutrients and things like that. So yeah, like you mentioned, his work, went a long way in terms of elucidating that, but that is still taken as like a pro ultra processed food stance, and therefore it's corrupt science by the corrupted establishment, academia, research, big food or whatever, right? And another element, and you'll touch on this, is the other thing that they propose is that it is addictive, right? They are designed to be addictive. Not just, oh, they taste good, I want more, right? But they are designed to be addictive just in the way of like illicit hard drugs. And that leads us to this paper, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's a perfect transition. So this paper, they're trying to build on their previous research and understand, okay, so people were able to eat 500 calories more every day if they're eating ultra processed food versus less processed food, which that's still a big deal. And I think that in that study, they were really trying to match the types of diets. So I know like you gave the example of like an apple versus an M&M, and that's still true, but in their case, they were even being more like, okay, we're going to try to make similar style meals, but have them be like different in processing. That's still hard to accomplish, honestly, but still it's like 500 extra calories a day. Like that adds up a lot with like body fat, body weight. So they're like, okay, one of the things that people often say as a reason for why ultra processed foods are addictive, or they claim that it's addictive, which is a whole like controversial thing, if like food can be addictive, etc. But they're like, it's got to be through dopamine pathways. And so if your brain releases dopamine when you eat ultra processed foods, it might be like a super dopamine response compared to a less processed food. And then that like causes you to want to eat more of it. And I'm not an expert in dopamine and brain stuff, but that's just kind of how the story goes. So they're like, let's
Neither are the
test
people
it.
that talk about it.
I know. So at least like, yeah, it's funny because I'll be like masters and like doing my PhD in nutrition. I'm like, so I'm not an expert on ultra processed foods, but like, then I'm like, whatever. I'm better than a lot of these people that like are lawyers that are like making policies. Anyways,
Yeah.
what they did in this study is they had people across the BMI scale. So they took 50 people and they had them pretty evenly distributed among like normal BMI and the obesity BMI category, because they're interested in being able to capture a pretty good range of body weights in people. And what they had them do is they did a PET scan in these people before and after they had an ultra processed milkshake. So the methods for the PET scan are interesting, and they're basically gonna figure out like when the brain is having a dopamine response. I won't get into the specific methods, but like they use dopamine receptor antagonists, and it's really cool. So it's not directly looking at like dopamine, but it's looking at like whether or not something is binding to a dopamine receptor. And so in the paper, you can read it. And they're basically comparing dopamine responses when people have fasted. So they fasted for like 17 hours and they're staying inside of the NIH metabolism units. So again, it's like that really nice design where they're controlling what they're eating. They're like, the participants are not able to like go out and like drink, the night before the study. They're like controlled. So they have their PET scan and fasting. And then after they have an ultra processed milkshake, they do a PET scan again. And so their hypothesis was that you would see a difference in your dopamine levels when you had a milkshake, because, that's probably why people want to have more milkshake or more of like these ultra processed things. And what they found was that there was no difference in their brain dopamine response when they were fasting and when they had the milkshake. And so that goes against the hypothesis that you would require a dopamine response to be addicted to ultra processed foods. And that was the name of the study. It was something like dopamine responses are highly variable in response to ultra processed milkshake. So that was published in early March. And Dr. Kevin Hall, who's the senior author of the study, he retired a week ago. So like in mid-April. And we can talk about the reasons he says that led to him retiring.
Yeah. Let's stick a little bit more on the data.
Oh yeah. I mean, I did this for Journal Club yesterday. So like,
Oh yeah, you're
it
all
was
about
great
it.
to hear other people's opinions as well.
Yeah. One, it's a super cool, well-designed study, and like that's one of his, I would say, trademarks, is being able to do these super well-controlled, extensive studies, right? But yeah, it's questioning the underlying hypothesis, right? That ultra processed food is addictive via some sort of dopaminergic response, right? And obviously, I'm not a above the neck expert either, but this, as you said, shows that no, there was no dopaminergic response. There was no dopamine response. Now they don't want to say caveat, but they do say that's not to say that these ultra processed foods, or in this case, a milkshake, is not quote unquote addictive, right? Or not something that people would consume more of, but it's just not through this mechanism that was proposed or hypothesized, right? Because the changes were, below the level of that was detectable by the scan, and also much less than what you would see in actual like illicit drugs. You know what I mean? And then one thing just on the dopamine thing, like this is I'm sure you see this too, but this is one of those buzzwords that is all out there. People obsessing about dopamine. Oh, get real dopamine, not fake dopamine. Oh, I'm gonna increase my dopamine. I'm gonna have a real dopamine hit or whatever. Do this for dopamine. You can't fucking measure dopamine unless you're in a lab. And so this idea, this is something I talk about, and you've heard me talk about it before, but obsessing over these things that you cannot measure is a complete distraction. It's a distraction because you can't tell, is my dopamine higher? You can how do you feel? How about that?
Mm-hmm.
Right? How do you feel? Just go off that. Oh, I did this, so it increased my dopamine. And then it becomes like you're gaslighting yourself. I feel better because I got dopamine. No, you feel better because you did something that you wanted to do, right? I talk about this with like autophagy. Oh, I exercise, I'm fasting, I turn on autophagy. I need to turn on autophagy. You can't measure that. Why are you even thinking about that? Just like do the thing for the outcome, right? But it turns into this thing of like you do the thing for this thing that will lead to the outcome, but then doing the thing becomes the whole thing. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's like going to therapy. You go to therapy to like have some sort of behavioral outcome or whatever, right? But then it's like I go to therapy, so I go to therapy and then I feel good, rather than like no, you're going for a purpose. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. And like what you said about you eat the food, you may have a dopamine response, but like ultimately what matters is if you like it and or like something that's very subjective. So in the study, they further analyzed people into those that had some dopamine response and those that didn't. And they're trying to compare what might be different in the people that had a dopamine response to the milkshake and those that didn't. The only things that were significant and that were different between these two groups was their rating of how pleasant, and that's the way that they studied it. So pleasantness of the milkshake and desire for like more. So they basically were like, oh, the people that had dopamine responses liked the milkshake and wanted more of it, and the people that didn't have a big dopamine response didn't want more of the milkshake. But they looked at like glucose and insulin and other types of variables, and those things weren't different in the participants. It wasn't different by body size or BMI either, because that's another
Right.
idea is like maybe when somebody has obesity, they have a lower dopamine response to food, so then they keep eating more to like get to some level of dopamine, but they didn't find that, at least not with this milkshake, which is another point. My lab was kind of laughing about this where we're like they one of the limitations in the study is that like how do we know that the participants liked this milkshake? It was not super high in sugar compared to milkshakes that I see when like I go through a drive-through at Taco Bell, and it was like 400 something calories. And I was just like, I feel like people could get dopamine from like eating Chips Ahoy or Oreos or many other things like commercial products. Why didn't they
Mm-hmm.
test a commercial product as well? So we could also like critique the study as in like maybe there are foods that would cause a dopamine response, ultra processed and like less processed. Maybe the milkshake wasn't a good stimulus. We don't know.
Right.
But like the way that I'll say allegedly that the government reacted to the study is like, bro, just just let them be. Like scientists will
Yeah.
criticize the study for you. If you censor it, it looks really bad. But like,
Yeah.
just shut up, let scientists talk, and we'll like tear this guy to we'll tear him to shreds. Like
Right.
in our journal club, you don't gotta censor what he did.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. When you read the study, I'll just say this: if you censor something, it makes it seem like this is like this huge, profound. This changes everything. Like I don't know, monumental, data. When in reality, no research study is that. Right? Research is incremental and flawed, right? Like you mentioned, there are limitations, there are shortcomings, and they discuss them in the paper themselves, right? And yeah, like you say, if you put something out there, other researchers, other academics, other people in the field are going to criticize it and highlight the limitations and critique what the conclusions could be and what you can generalize from it and what you can say about it, right? But if you censor it, it makes it look like the thing that they are claiming the government and science does. They literally did the thing of censoring research because it doesn't fit a narrative. They literally did the thing that they are campaigning on.
Yeah. And the thing that I feel like I'm like, look, I'm not trying to give advice to like authoritarians or anything, but I'm like, I would just let them do the study. Who cares? Like, make your policies anyways. But like, it seems so childish to me. Like, what? You can't
Yeah.
have a study get published that like only nerds are gonna read. You can't let that happen. Like, seriously? Like, just claim that there's other pathways that cause ultra processed
Yeah.
foods to be addictive. That could be true. And like, I
Right.
totally think it's understandable that people could get addicted to types of foods. That's fine. But this paper just doesn't support that it happens through dopamine. But
Yeah.
just say something else is causing it. Like, if you want to be bad, I'm not, I
Right,
wouldn't
right,
do
right.
that.
Yeah.
But like, I'm just like, man, good thing I'm not a bad guy because I'd be too powerful.
That being said, they did censor. Was it what was the specific data? He wasn't allowed to present it at a conference. Was that what it was?
So, related to ultra processed food stuff, he was not able to present at a conference. And this is reported in various news sources. So, like CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, and then Washington Post all had stories on this. And then he also made like a LinkedIn post.
Right.
So, gathering all that and reading through all that, the common things that he claims, and I believe him for the record, but just the things that he claims happened were that he wasn't allowed to speak at a conference. So scientists, when we present at conferences, usually, in my experience, it's like you're not supposed to present things that have been published. You're presenting stuff that
Yeah.
nobody has seen. And so you're giving people like kind of like a early glance at what you're
Right.
about to get published. So that would be the time to present is before you publish. So he wasn't able to do that. When the New York Times wanted to do a telephone interview with him and his higher ups, once the Trump administration was in
That's
power,
right.
his higher ups were like, you can't do a telephone interview, but you can answer their questions in writing. So he did it. And then it had to go through like the publicity center or whoever for the press. And then they altered his responses to downplay the study. Now, what they specifically downplayed was the sample size. So the study had 50 people in it. But if you're in this field, you know that 50 people getting PET scans and having all their food provided for them, being very comprehensively like studied in all these different ways, 50 people is large. And on top of that, the primary purpose of the study was to answer this question about dopamine. So they do analysis called power analysis, and they understand like how many people do you need to have the power to answer your question. So like it's really dumb, and not dumb, but like they don't know what they're talking about to say 50 people is a small
Right.
study in this context. But that's
Right.
what they allegedly were like harping on. And then Dr. Hall tried to communicate with the like NIH and the HHS leadership, didn't get a response from them.
When did you first sort of have something that was a red flag or felt like something was amiss?
Yeah, so in 21 years at the NIH, I've never been denied the opportunity to present our science at a scientific conference. And I had the opportunity to do so at the beginning of this month. I had an invitation that I tried to clear through the normal process at the NIH. And it was highlighted that this was a topic of interest to the agency. And so it went up to a higher level at Health and Human Services above the NIH level. And it was denied. And at first I thought, okay, well, this is maybe just because there's a travel pause, and the organizers of the conference invited me to do it online, just a virtual presentation. And then that was denied and no reason was given. And that was the first hint that something might be amiss.
That had not happened to you before. You said in 21 years, it's like that's part of what you're a scientist. You present research. This gets denied.
That's
and then
part
there's
of my job.
Yeah,
so this was a paper that was already out the door. It was going to be published when the new administration came in. And we'd actually prepared a press release within the NIH to discuss this paper. And what we were interested in doing was understanding when people consume ultra-processed foods, do they really hijack the brain's reward system in a way that we know addictive drugs do, like drugs like methamphetamine or cocaine. They cause this really large increase in dopamine in the brain. And so we decided to test, does the same thing happen with ultra-processed milkshakes that are really high in fat and sugar? And so we designed this study that took many, many years. It was the largest study of its kind, the most well-controlled. We actually had people admitted to the hospital for several days to control their diet in a way that had never been done before. And we published this result, which was interesting. It seemed that these foods, while they may be addictive in many people, didn't cause the outsized increase in dopamine that many drugs that are highly addictive do. And it really challenged some of the narratives behind how these foods actually work to change your brain chemistry. And so that was the main conclusion of our paper was, yeah, these foods might be addictive in many people, and we really need to understand that better, but it's probably not working in the way that many of us thought it was working in the past. So that paper was due to be published, and it was published. And we had a reporter ask for an interview to discuss the findings of that paper for a piece that she was writing in the New York Times. And that interview was denied. Our press release was also quashed for no reason given. And finally, the reporter at the New York Times asked, what is it? Why can't I have an interview? I've actually interviewed Dr. Hall before. We'd really love his input on this paper. And then she actually received a telephone call from the HHS communications director asking whether or not this was really a piece about RFK Jr., because the paper didn't seem to fully support the preconceived narrative that ultra-processed foods are addictive. And so I was shocked to hear about this. And after that conversation, the reporter was given the ability to ask written questions, to which I responded to those written questions through our press office and gave approval to some slight edits about whether drugs were drugs of abuse or addiction. And then what I saw was fascinating, because the responses that were then sent to the reporter had been edited, trying to downplay the study, saying it was very small when it was actually the largest of its kind, and that the participants had only been in the hospital for 5 days, when this was actually the only study that had that level of control. And it struck me as really concerning, because if people were willing to say, there's a little bit of daylight between our preconceived notions about even how the basic science of food addiction might work and the narrative that was going on, what is it going to be like if they want to start, actually meddling in the research itself? Yeah. That was my concern. And I actually then tried to raise that with the NIH director and RFK Jr. directly.
He also had to withdraw from being an author on a paper that mentioned health disparities. I think the word was like health disparity. Right. So they're like, you can't be on this paper because it says health disparity or health inequity. And he was like, I don't think that I can stay and keep working here. I think that those are the main things that happened. I don't know if I forgot.
He took his name off the author line for that paper. Mm-hmm. So it would be published still.
Yeah, because otherwise they would have had to change what they were saying.
Right.
So I had been working for about a year or more, actually, with various university scientists around the country to prepare a really comprehensive review on what we know about ultra-processed foods in various aspects. And part of the paper was written by a colleague at a university on health equity and how these foods are, being targeted to underprivileged communities and why this is a potential problem. And I put the paper through the usual NIH process of getting approval to have this paper submitted for publication. And it actually went through the process until the very next day, where it was flagged that because of this description of health equity in the paper, that would have to be edited to comply with executive orders, or else I would have to remove myself as an author. Now, I didn't write that section. I wasn't going to censor my colleague, and so I voluntarily removed myself as an author. Again, it's the very first time that's happened to me in 21 years.
Yeah. So he took an early retirement. This was in his LinkedIn post, which is how I came across this that you shared, that you posted. So decided to take an early retirement rather than trying to, he made efforts, right, to try to see what the issue was and tried to resolve it so he can continue to do his work and continue to be there. But to no avail, right, they didn't get back to him. And rather than resigning out of protest, as he put it, and losing out on his health insurance and the health insurance of his family, he was very upfront about that, he took an early retirement. Which, this is happening a ton, right? This is happening a ton in every field, in every area, in many different organizations. But, it happened in ours. And so like I was saying earlier, this really makes the point of that it is not something that is happening over there to those people in those fields, but it is ubiquitous. It is ubiquitous, and for stupid, malicious reasons. I can go on with more adjectives, but I'll just keep it at those.